Zektar had served aboard 17 different vessels throughout his 40-cycle career as a xenobiologist for the Galactic Research Consortium. He had studied the crystalline hive minds of Xerion Prime, documented the gaseous intelligence clouds of the Nebula Collective, and even spent 3 harrowing cycles observing the predatory Vashtii hunters in their natural habitat. Nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for his assignment to observe humanity. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Earth's recent admission to the galactic community had raised questions about human behavioral patterns that existing databases couldn't adequately explain. Command wanted a comprehensive study of human psychology, social structures, and, most importantly, their military capabilities. What made humans so effective in combat situations when their physical attributes seemed unremarkable compared to other species? Zektar's ship, the research vessel Silent Observer, maintained a cloaked position in Earth's outer asteroid belt. His initial observations had been routine, cataloging human settlements, analyzing communication patterns, studying their primitive but surprisingly effective technology. Everything seemed normal until he witnessed his first human military engagement. The conflict began in what humans call the Australian Outback, where a terrorist organization had taken hostages in an abandoned mining facility. Zektar watched through long-range sensors as human military forces surrounded the compound. He expected a prolonged siege, perhaps negotiations, followed by either a peaceful resolution or a calculated assault with acceptable losses, standard procedure for most civilized species. Instead, he witnessed something that made his chitinous exoskeleton shiver with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. The human commander, a female designated as Colonel Sarah Martinez according to intercepted communications, gathered her team for what appeared to be a final briefing. Through enhanced audio pickups, Zektar listened as she outlined the mission parameters. 27 hostages inside, unknown number of hostiles, potential explosive devices, and a 6-hour deadline before the terrorists began executing prisoners. What struck Zektar first was not the tactical discussion, but the absolute calm in the humans' voices. There was no panic, no fear pheromone release that his sensors could detect, no signs of the pre-combat stress responses he'd documented in dozens of other species. Instead, there was something else, something that made his 3 hearts beat faster as he watched. The assault began at exactly 0347 hours local time. 8 humans moved through the compound with a fluidity that seemed impossible for bipedal creatures. They communicated in whispers and hand signals, adapting their approach as conditions changed, supporting each other with an instinctive coordination that reminded Zektar of the legendary warrior bonds of the extinct Kethara Empire. But it was what happened next that fundamentally changed Zektar's understanding of what humans truly were. During the breach of the main building, one of the human soldiers, a young male the others called Rodriguez, stepped on a concealed pressure plate. The explosive device detonated, collapsing part of the ceiling and trapping him under debris. His left leg was clearly broken, and thermal imaging showed significant blood loss. By all logical calculations, the team should have extracted their wounded member and reassessed their approach. Instead, Rodriguez looked up at his team leader and said something that Zektar's translation software initially couldn't process. "Leave me. Get the hostages." The team leader, a grizzled veteran named Thompson, stared down at his wounded subordinate for exactly 2.3 seconds. Zektar timed it. Then, Thompson made a decision that defied every tactical manual in the known galaxy. "Negative. We don't leave anyone behind." What followed was a display of coordinated ferocity that Zektar had never seen from any sentient species. The remaining 7 humans didn't just continue their mission, they accelerated it. Moving with renewed purpose, they swept through the compound like a force of nature. When terrorists fired upon them, they returned fire with precision that bordered on supernatural. When obstacles blocked their path, they created new ones. When a situation called for subtlety, they were shadows. When it demanded violence, they became something else entirely. Zektar watched through his sensors as Thompson carried Rodriguez on his back, while simultaneously directing his team's assault. The human showed no signs of fatigue, no decrease in tactical awareness, no reduction in combat effectiveness. If anything, the presence of his wounded teammate seemed to make him more dangerous. The rescue was completed in 17 minutes and 43 seconds. All 27 hostages were freed alive. All terrorists were neutralized, some captured, some killed, all subdued, and Rodriguez, despite his injuries, survived to be evacuated with his team. As Zektar reviewed the recordings, he found himself focusing on the moment when Thompson had refused to leave Rodriguez behind. He had witnessed countless military operations, studied hundreds of species' approaches to warfare and crisis management. Most civilized species operated on mathematical principles: acceptable losses, calculated risks, strategic sacrifices for the greater good. Humans seemed to operate on something else entirely. He decided to expand his research. Over the following weeks, Zektar documented dozens of human military operations, emergency responses, and crisis situations. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. In every scenario where human lives were at stake, other humans would take extraordinary risks to preserve them. They would charge into burning buildings to save strangers. They would donate organs to people they'd never met. They would adopt children from different continents, different cultures, different genetic backgrounds, and raise them as their own. But it was the darker side of this protective instinct that truly unsettled Zektar. He observed a human military unit in what their records called the Congo Basin, where they were conducting peacekeeping operations for the United Nations. The unit had been assigned to protect a refugee camp that housed approximately 3,000 displaced civilians. Intelligence reports indicated that a local warlord planned to attack the camp to reclaim territory and eliminate potential witnesses to his war crimes. The human peacekeeping force consisted of exactly 47 soldiers from various Earth nations: American, British, Canadian, Australian, and others. They were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1 by the approaching militia forces. Standard military doctrine would suggest evacuation or strategic withdrawal to a more defensible position. The humans chose to fight. Zektar watched as they transformed the refugee camp into a fortress. They dug trenches, established overlapping fields of fire, set up medical stations, and prepared for a siege. But more importantly, they did something that chilled Zektar at his core. They looked happy. Not the simple pleasure response he'd observe in other species when they engaged in preferred activities. This was something deeper, more primal. These humans were preparing to face almost certain death to protect people who weren't even their own species' genetic relatives, and they were approaching it with what could only be described as anticipation. The attack came at dawn. 300 militia fighters with superior numbers, local knowledge, and heavy weapons advanced on a defensive position held by 47 humans protecting 3,000 refugees. The mathematics were simple. The humans would be overrun within hours. Zektar watched the battle unfold with growing amazement and horror. The humans didn't just fight. They fought with a creativity and viciousness that seemed to increase as the situation became more desperate. They turned kitchen utensils into improvised weapons, used refugee camp supplies to create explosive devices, and coordinated their defense with a tactical flexibility that bordered on precognitive. When the militia broke through the outer perimeter, the humans fell back to prepared positions. When those positions became untenable, they adapted, regrouped, and counterattacked. When their ammunition began to run low, they switched to hand-to-hand combat with an efficiency that made Zektar's stomach turn. He watched a human medic named Dr. Jennifer Walsh treat wounded civilians while simultaneously directing mortar fire against advancing enemies. He observed a communications specialist called Sergeant Jackson coordinate air support while applying tourniquets to his own severed leg. He witnessed a young private, barely out of adolescence according to human aging patterns, single-handedly hold a defensive position for 47 minutes against overwhelming odds, buying time for civilian evacuation. The battle lasted 14 hours. When relief forces finally, arrived, they found 31 living humans, 16 human corpses, and nearly 3,000 safe refugees. The attacking militia had been completely destroyed or scattered. Not a single refugee had been harmed. As Zektar compiled his observations, he began to understand what he had witnessed. Other species fought for territory, resources, survival, or dominance. Humans fought for each other, not just for their genetic relatives or social groups, but for abstract concepts like innocence and justice and human dignity. They would die for strangers. They would kill for strangers. They would sacrifice everything they had for people they would never meet, simply because those people were considered worth protecting. This wasn't just unusual behavior, it was terrifying behavior. It meant that humans couldn't be predicted, controlled, or negotiated with using conventional diplomatic methods. Their decision-making processes weren't based on rational self-interest or even tribal loyalty. They were based on moral frameworks that superseded their own survival instincts. Zektar realized he was witnessing something that had never been properly documented in galactic history, a species that had weaponized compassion. He began studying human historical records, accessing their primitive but extensive digital archives. What he found there confirmed his worst fears. Humans have been displaying this pattern of behavior throughout their entire recorded history. They had fought wars to end slavery, even though slavery was economically beneficial to the winning societies. They had sacrificed their lives to protect other humans from persecution, even when those humans belonged to different tribes, nations, or belief systems. They had developed something called the Geneva Convention, which established rules for warfare designed to minimize suffering, even the suffering of their enemies. They had created international law, human rights declarations, and global institutions dedicated to protecting people they would never meet in countries they would never visit. And, most disturbing of all, they had developed nuclear weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and then chosen not to use them. Zektar's preliminary reports to the Galactic Research Consortium had been met with skepticism and requests for additional verification. His superiors found it difficult to believe that any species could survive evolutionary pressures while maintaining such apparently self-destructive behavioral patterns. They wanted more data, more examples, more proof that humans were as dangerous as Zektar claimed. He was preparing to provide exactly that when his sensors detected unusual activity in the Sol system. 3 vessels had entered human space without authorization. Ships that matched the configuration of Kethran raiders, the same extinct warrior species that Zektar had referenced in his observations of human tactical coordination. Except the Kethra weren't extinct. They had simply been hiding, rebuilding, preparing for a return to the galactic community that had exiled them for their aggressive expansionism centuries earlier. And now they were testing the newest species in the galaxy, probing human defenses, evaluating Earth as a potential target for conquest or plunder. Zektar watched as human detection systems identified the intruders. He monitored their communications as alerts were transmitted throughout their military networks. He observed as their defensive systems activated and their patrol vessels moved to intercept positions. But what happened next surprised even him. Instead of immediately attacking or demanding withdrawal, the humans transmitted a message to the Kethran raiders on standard galactic frequencies. Unknown vessels, this is Earth Defense Command. You are in violation of established territorial boundaries. State your intentions and prepare for inspection or withdraw immediately. This is your only warning. The Kethran response was predictable. They attacked. What followed was Zektar's first opportunity to observe humans in actual space combat against a known hostile species. The engagement lasted exactly 27 minutes and 14 seconds. When it ended, all 3 Kethran vessels had been destroyed, their crews killed or captured, and their technology confiscated for study. But it wasn't the outcome that shocked Zektar, it was the method. The humans hadn't just defeated the Kethran raiders. They had done it while simultaneously attempting to minimize casualties, preserve enemy vessels for study, and protect civilian shipping in nearby space lanes. They had fought with one hand while extending the other in a gesture of potential mercy. Even more disturbing, their tactical communications revealed that human military commanders had been disappointed by the necessity of using lethal force. They had hoped to resolve the situation diplomatically, despite facing a species known throughout the galaxy for their militaristic aggression and complete disregard for non-combatant safety. As Zektar prepared his final report on the incident, he realized that his 40-cycle career in xenobiology had been fundamentally inadequate preparation for understanding humanity. Every framework he had developed for analyzing species behavior, every model he had constructed for predicting civilizational development, every assumption he had made about the relationship between intelligence and survival strategy had been invalidated by 6 months of observing human society. Humans were something new in the galaxy, a species that had achieved technological sophistication, military superiority, and social organization while maintaining behavioral patterns that should have led to extinction within generations of developing advanced weaponry. They had created a civilization based on protecting the weak, supporting the disadvantaged, and sacrificing for the benefit of future generations they would never meet. And they had done it all while developing the most terrifyingly effective military capabilities Zektar had ever documented. He looked at his preliminary conclusions and felt something his species rarely experienced: genuine uncertainty about the future. Earth's admission to the galactic community had been viewed as a routine expansion of civilized space, the integration of another promising but unremarkable species into the established order of things. Zektar now understood that humanity's integration into galactic civilization wouldn't be routine at all. It would be transformative, challenging, and potentially revolutionary. Because humans didn't just fight to win, they fought to protect. And in a galaxy filled with species that had learned to accept calculated losses and strategic sacrifices as normal parts of existence, the presence of beings who refused to abandon each other would change everything. The question that kept Zektar awake during his sleep cycles wasn't whether humans would succeed in galactic society. Based on everything he had observed, their success seemed inevitable. The question was whether galactic society would survive contact with human moral frameworks. As he began composing his formal report, Zektar realized he was documenting something that would reshape xenobiological understanding throughout the known galaxy. He was witnessing the emergence of a species that had weaponized love, militarized compassion, and turned protective instincts into a force that could challenge the fundamental assumptions of interstellar civilization. And for the first time in his long career studying dangerous species throughout the galaxy, Zektar found himself genuinely afraid. Zektar's report to the Galactic Research Consortium had been classified at the highest levels and distributed to only 7 individuals across the known galaxy. Within 48 hours of its transmission, he received new orders: continue observation and prepare for direct contact protocols. The consortium wanted more information before making any decisions about humanity's future in galactic society. What they didn't tell Zektar was that his observations had triggered emergency sessions among the Council of Species, heated debates in the Galactic Senate, and urgent consultations with military commanders throughout civilized space. Several species had already begun quiet preparations for potential conflict, while others had started exploring diplomatic approaches that might contain or channel human aggression. None of them understood what Zektar was beginning to realize: that human aggression was not the primary threat they represented. The breakthrough in Zektar's understanding came during what humans call the Mumbai incident. A massive earthquake had struck the Indian subcontinent, triggering tsunamis, collapsing infrastructure, and trapping millions of civilians in affected areas. Human emergency response protocols activated immediately, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed local capabilities within hours. Zektar monitored the situation through multiple sensor networks, expecting to document standard disaster response patterns: resource allocation based on strategic value, population triage according to survivability calculations, and the inevitable abandonment of unsalvageable areas. Most civilized species had developed efficient protocols for managing large-scale catastrophes by accepting calculated losses and focusing resources on achievable objectives. Humans did something different. Within 6 hours of the initial earthquake, Zektar detected massive mobilization patterns across the entire planet. Not just from India's neighboring countries, but from nations thousands of kilometers away. Military aircraft from America, medical teams from Germany, rescue specialists from Japan, engineering corps from Britain, and emergency supplies from dozens of other countries began converging on the disaster zone. But it wasn't just governmental response. It was something far more comprehensive and disturbing. Zektar watched as human civilians organized their own relief efforts, pooling personal resources, chartering private aircraft, and traveling to the affected areas to provide assistance. He observed doctors canceling vacations to volunteer in field hospitals, construction workers using personal savings to purchase equipment for rescue operations, and ordinary citizens donating blood, food, and money to support relief efforts. Most shocking of all, he documented cases of humans traveling from other continents specifically to dig through rubble, searching for survivors they had never met and would never see again. The scale of the response was unprecedented in Zektar's experience. By his calculations, the resources being deployed exceeded the strategic value of the affected population by several orders of magnitude. The economic cost of the relief effort would exceed the gross domestic product of many smaller nations. The human response was not just inefficient, it was economically irrational, and it was absolutely unstoppable. Zektar focused his observations on a rescue team from the Canadian Urban Search and Rescue Task Force, led by a human female designated as Commander Lisa Chun. The team had been deployed to a collapsed apartment complex where seismic readings indicated possible survivors in the basement levels. Standard rescue protocols would involve a careful risk assessment, structured excavation procedures, and withdrawal if conditions became too dangerous for rescue personnel. Chen's team ignored standard protocols entirely. Working in shifts around the clock, they excavated rubble by hand when machinery proved too dangerous, crawled through unstable passages that could collapse at any moment, and continued operations despite repeated aftershocks that threatened to bring down what remained of the building structure. When local authorities recommended abandoning the site due to safety concerns, Chen's response was recorded by Zektar's audio sensors. There are still people down there. We don't leave until everyone is accounted for. The excavation continued for 6 days. Chen's team was eventually joined by volunteers from 17 different countries, working together despite language barriers, cultural differences, and the constant threat of secondary collapse. They created a multinational rescue operation united by nothing more than shared determination to save lives. On the 6th day, they recovered the last survivor, a 73-year-old human male who had survived by drinking water from a broken pipe and eating scattered food supplies. By then, the rescue operation had cost more in resources, personnel, and equipment than the economic value that the survivor could contribute to society for the remainder of his expected lifespan. Zektar realized he was observing behavior that violated every principle of evolutionary biology he had studied. These humans were expending massive resources to save individuals who provided no genetic benefit to the species, no economic advantage to their societies, and no strategic value to their nations. They were doing it simply because those individuals were alive and needed help. It was the most terrifying thing Zektar had ever documented. He began analyzing human disaster response patterns throughout their recorded history, accessing their digital archives and historical databases. What he discovered confirmed his growing dread. Humans had been displaying this pattern of behavior for thousands of years. They had mounted massive rescue operations for individuals trapped in mines, sailors lost at sea, climbers stranded on mountains, and explorers isolated in remote locations. They had created international organizations dedicated to disaster relief, medical assistance, and humanitarian aid. They had established protocols for sharing resources during emergencies that superseded national boundaries, political disputes, and economic competition. They had built a global civilization that prioritized life preservation over resource optimization. Most disturbing of all, they had done this while simultaneously developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare and destruction. Humans could create weapons capable of devastating entire planets, and then use those same technologies to save lives during natural disasters. They could engineer diseases that would wipe out enemy populations, and then deploy those same scientific capabilities to cure diseases that threaten their own species. Zektar began to understand why his report had generated such concern among galactic leadership. Humans represented something unprecedented in known space, a species with the technological capability to dominate the galaxy, but the moral framework to potentially liberate it. His analysis was interrupted by the detection of a galactic consortium survey vessel entering the Sol system. The ship, designated Diplomatic Observer, carried Ambassador Thexlin of the Altarian Council, one of the 7 individuals who had received Zektar's classified report. Thexlin's mission was officially described as a preliminary diplomatic contact, designed to establish formal communication protocols with Earth's governments before proceeding with standard integration procedures. Zektar knew the real purpose. Thexlin was there to evaluate whether humans represented a threat to galactic stability that required containment or elimination. The initial contact proceeded according to established protocols. Thexlin's vessel broadcast standard greeting messages on multiple frequencies, identifying itself as a representative of the galactic community and requesting permission to establish diplomatic relations with Earth's governing authorities. Human response was swift and surprising. Instead of the typical governmental chaos that most species experienced when confronted with evidence of galactic civilization, Earth's leadership presented a unified response within 18 hours. The humans established a joint committee representing the United Nations, major world powers, and scientific organizations to conduct first contact procedures. They prepared translation protocols, assembled expert teams, and organized secure communication channels. Most remarkably, they did all of this while simultaneously maintaining complete transparency with their global population through media broadcasts and public information releases. Zektar had never observed a species that conducted first contact as a public process rather than a classified governmental operation. The formal diplomatic meetings took place aboard the Diplomatic Observer, with human representatives including Secretary General Maria Santos of the United Nations, Dr. James Park from NASA, and Colonel Sarah Martinez, the same military commander Zektar had observed during the Australian hostage rescue. Thexlin had specifically requested the inclusion of military personnel to assess human martial capabilities and strategic thinking. Zektar monitored the negotiations through enhanced sensor networks, focusing particularly on human responses to questions about their military doctrines, territorial ambitions, and plans for expansion beyond their solar system. He expected the typical pattern of diplomatic evasion, strategic misdirection, and careful probing for advantages that characterized most first contact scenarios. Instead, the humans were remarkably forthright about their capabilities and intentions. When Thexlin inquired about Earth's military strength, Colonel Martinez provided detailed information about human weapons technology, troop levels, and strategic doctrines. When asked about territorial expansion plans, the human delegates explained their space exploration programs with complete transparency, including their intentions to establish colonies on Mars and mining operations in the asteroid belt. But it was their response to questions about their intentions toward other species that truly alarmed both Thexlin and Zektar. Secretary General Santos explained humanity's perspective on interstellar relations with a directness that violated every principle of diplomatic negotiation. Our primary goal is the protection and advancement of all sentient life. We believe that every intelligent species has inherent value and deserves the right to exist develop, and pursue happiness according to their own cultural frameworks. We would like to contribute to galactic civilization by sharing our knowledge, resources, and capabilities in whatever way best serves the common good. Fexlin's response was predictably skeptical. Most species claimed peaceful intentions during first contact negotiations, only to reveal aggressive or exploitative agendas once they gained access to galactic resources and technology. He decided to test human sincerity by presenting them with a hypothetical scenario, a conflict between two galactic species that threatened to escalate into system-wide warfare, with both sides claiming territorial and resource rights in disputed space. The human response revealed exactly what Zektar had been afraid of. Dr. Park immediately began analyzing the scenario from multiple perspectives, questioning the underlying causes of the conflict, the historical grievances involved, and the potential for mediated resolution. Colonel Martinez focused on the military aspects, but her questions centered on minimizing casualties rather than achieving strategic advantages. Secretary General Santos asked about the civilian populations affected by the conflict and whether humanitarian assistance might help address underlying economic or social pressures. Within 2 hours, the human delegation had developed a comprehensive intervention proposal that included peacekeeping forces, economic development aid, cultural exchange programs, and long-term conflict resolution mechanisms. They offered to commit Earth's resources to implementing the solution, despite having no strategic interest in the hypothetical conflict and no guarantee of compensation for their efforts. Fexlin realized he was facing something his diplomatic training had never prepared him for, a species that approached interstellar relations as an opportunity for service rather than dominance. The negotiations continued for 6 days, during which Fexlin systematically tested human responses to various scenarios involving resource disputes, territorial conflicts, technological advantages, and military threats. In every case, the humans demonstrated the same pattern. They sought solutions that benefited all parties involved, even when those solutions required significant sacrifices from Earth. Most disturbing was their response to direct questions about galactic power structures. When Fexlin explained the hierarchical nature of galactic civilization, with stronger species maintaining authority over weaker ones through economic and military leverage, the humans expressed immediate concern about the welfare of subordinate species. They asked detailed questions about rights protections, economic exploitation, and opportunities for advancement within the existing system. Colonel Martinez's questions were particularly pointed. What happens to species that can't defend themselves? How do you prevent stronger civilizations from enslaving or eliminating weaker ones? What protections exist for individual rights within species that don't share human concepts of personal freedom? Fexlin found himself defending galactic institutions that he had never questioned, explaining systems that suddenly seemed inadequate when viewed through human moral frameworks. The existing order maintained stability through balanced power structures and calculated compromises. Most species accepted their positions within the hierarchy because the alternatives, chaos, warfare, or extinction, were worse than subordination. Humans seemed to believe that there were alternatives to hierarchical power structures that hadn't been explored. Dr. Park presented detailed proposals for restructuring galactic economic systems to prevent exploitation. Colonel Martinez outlined military doctrines based on protection rather than conquest, and Secretary General Santos described legal frameworks that could ensure individual rights across species boundaries. They weren't just criticizing existing institutions, they were offering alternatives. By the end of the negotiations, Fexlin had reached the same conclusion that Zektar had documented in his reports. Humans didn't represent a military threat to galactic civilization. They represented something far more dangerous. They were a species with the technological capability to enforce moral standards that most galactic civilizations had abandoned as impractical idealism. They could remake the galaxy according to their own ethical principles. Fexlin's private communications with the Galactic Council, which Zektar intercepted through advanced signal processing, revealed the depth of concern among galactic leadership. Several species had begun quiet preparations for preemptive action against Earth, while others were exploring ways to limit human influence through economic or political containment. The Kethara exile fleet, still rebuilding after their failed probe of human space, had offered their services as mercenaries for any species willing to fund military action against Earth. But there were also voices calling for cooperation. Some council members had begun to recognize that human moral frameworks might offer solutions to long-standing galactic problems, species conflicts that had persisted for centuries, resource disputes that had defied resolution, and social injustices that had been accepted as inevitable aspects of interstellar civilization. The debate within galactic leadership centered on a fundamental question. Could the existing order survive contact with a species that refused to accept the moral compromises that made galactic civilization possible? Zektar knew the answer, even if the Council wasn't ready to acknowledge it. His months of observation had taught him that humans didn't make moral compromises. They found alternatives. When faced with situations that required choosing between competing values, they innovated solutions that preserved all their principles. When confronted with systematic injustices, they created new systems. When told that certain problems were unsolvable, they proved otherwise. Humans would not adapt to galactic civilization. They would transform it. As Thexlin prepared to leave the Sol system with his diplomatic report, Zektar began planning the next phase of his observation mission. The Galactic Council's response to first contact would reveal whether galactic civilization was ready for the changes that human integration would bring. Their decision would determine whether humanity joined the galaxy as partners or conquered it as liberators. Either way, Zektar was certain that nothing would ever be the same again. The Galactic Council's response to Ambassador Thexlin's report exceeded even Zektar's worst expectations. Within 72 hours of receiving the diplomatic summary, emergency sessions were convened across 17 different sectors of galactic space. The debates that followed revealed the fundamental fractures that human moral frameworks would create within established interstellar civilization. Zektar monitored the proceedings through classified communication channels, watching as centuries of diplomatic agreements and carefully balanced power structures began to unravel under the pressure of a single question. What would happen to galactic civilization if humans insisted on applying their ethical standards to interstellar relations? The Altarian Council, led by Thexlin's own species, advocated for immediate containment. Their proposal was elegantly simple. Earth would be quarantined within its own solar system, prevented from developing faster-than-light travel, and gradually integrated into galactic society only after human moral frameworks had been adjusted to accommodate existing realities. They argued that allowing unrestricted human expansion would destabilize the careful compromises that maintain peace throughout known space. The Crystalline Confederation took a more extreme position. Their hive mind intelligence viewed human individualism as a form of mental illness that could spread to other species through cultural contamination. They proposed complete isolation of Earth, enforced through military blockade, if necessary, until human civilization either collapsed or evolved beyond their current psychological frameworks. But the most chilling response came from the hegemony of corporate worlds, the economic powerhouse that controlled approximately 40% of galactic trade and resource extraction. Their representative, Director Vexnor, presented an analysis that treated humanity as both a threat and an opportunity. Humans could be valuable assets if properly controlled. Their protective instincts could be channeled into security services, their innovative capabilities could be harnessed for technological development, and their moral frameworks could be exploited for propaganda purposes. The hegemony proposed a solution that made Zektar's exoskeleton crawl with revulsion. Selective breeding programs to enhance useful human traits while eliminating problematic moral tendencies. Educational systems designed to redirect human protective instincts toward corporate interests. And economic structures that would make human civilization completely dependent on galactic resources. They wanted to domesticate humanity. The debates continued for weeks, with each faction presenting increasingly elaborate plans for managing the human problem. Some species suggested technological solutions: neural implants to suppress problematic emotional responses, genetic modifications to enhance compliance, or psychological conditioning to redirect human loyalty toward galactic authority structures. Others proposed political approaches: integration programs that would gradually expose humans to the realities of galactic politics, economic pressures that would force human governments to abandon their idealistic principles, or diplomatic frameworks that would limit human influence to ceremonial roles within existing power structures. Throughout all these discussions, one possibility was never seriously considered: the humans might be right about how galactic civilization should operate. Zektar found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His role as an observer required scientific objectivity and political neutrality, but his growing understanding of human capabilities made him certain that every proposed solution would fail catastrophically. The Council was debating how to contain or control a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history finding innovative solutions to impossible problems. They were planning to cage beings who had turned protective instincts into the most effective military doctrine in known space. His concerns proved justified when the first test of human responses was implemented. The Kethra Exile Fleet, acting as proxies for species that wanted to evaluate human military capabilities without direct confrontation, launched a series of raids against human shipping in the outer system. The attacks were carefully planned to appear as random piracy while actually probing human defensive capabilities, response times, and rules of engagement. The results were even more alarming than Zektar had predicted. Human response to the attacks was swift and comprehensive, but it wasn't the military efficiency that concerned galactic observers. It was the strategic implications of human tactical doctrines. Instead of simply destroying the raiders and securing their own shipping lanes, humans treated each attack as an intelligence opportunity. They captured Kethra vessels when possible, rescued enemy crews from disabled ships, and treated prisoners according to strict ethical guidelines that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment. More disturbing, they began investigating the underlying causes of Kethra aggression. Human intelligence services quickly identified the Exile Fleet's hidden bases, tracked their supply lines, and analyzed their communications networks. Within weeks, they had developed a comprehensive understanding of Kethra society, including their complex grievances against the galactic community that had led to their exile. Then, humans did something that shattered every assumption about interstellar conflict resolution. They offered to help solve the Kethra's problems. Secretary General Santos transmitted a message directly to the Kethra leadership, offering humanitarian aid for their struggling colonies, technical assistance for their failing life support systems, and diplomatic mediation for their disputes with the galactic community. The message concluded with an invitation for peaceful contact and an offer to discuss long-term solutions that would address Kethra needs without requiring piracy or territorial expansion. The Kethra response was predictably violent. They interpreted the offer as psychological warfare and intensified their attacks. But the pattern of human responses revealed something that sent shockwaves throughout galactic leadership. Humans were treating their enemies as potential allies who had simply chosen ineffective methods for addressing legitimate needs. They weren't fighting to win, they were fighting to heal. Zektar watched as human military forces systematically dismantled Kethra raiding capabilities while simultaneously offering increasingly generous terms for peaceful resolution. They provided medical aid to captured raiders, transmitted technical schematics for improving Kethra life support systems, and even included cultural gifts, music, art, and literature in their communications to enemy leadership. The psychological effect on Kethra forces was devastating. Warrior societies depend on clear distinctions between allies and enemies, but humans refused to fit into either category. They were enemies who acted like friends, opponents who offered assistance, and military forces that seemed genuinely concerned about Kethara welfare. The conflict ended when a damaged Kethara vessel carrying critically injured crew members was rescued by a human patrol ship. Instead of taking prisoners or demanding surrender, the human commander, Captain Rebecca Wong of the U.S. Defender, provided emergency medical treatment and transported the survivors to safety. She then personally delivered a message to the Kethara leadership offering immediate ceasefire and humanitarian assistance for any Kethara personnel who needed medical care. The psychological breakthrough came when Wong's actions were broadcast throughout the Kethara fleet. Warriors who had spent their entire lives believing that strength meant domination and survival required the destruction of enemies found themselves confronting beings who demonstrated strength through protection and achieved victory through mercy. 3 Kethara commanders defected to human protection, bringing detailed intelligence about the exile fleet's operations. More importantly, they brought questions that their own leadership couldn't answer. Why were humans willing to help enemies who had tried to kill them? What kind of civilization could afford to be both powerful and generous? How could a species maintain military effectiveness while adhering to moral principles that seem to require self-sacrifice? The answers to these questions, transmitted through Kethara communication networks, triggered the first major defection from galactic orthodoxy. Within days, Kethara colony ships began requesting permission to enter human space, seeking asylum from the exile fleet's increasingly desperate leadership. They didn't want to join human society. They wanted to learn how humans had solved the fundamental contradictions that Kethara civilization had never been able to resolve. The implications rippled throughout galactic space. If humans could successfully rehabilitate the most aggressively militaristic species in known space through moral example rather than superior firepower, what did that say about every other unsolvable conflict in galactic history? Zektar documented the crisis meetings that followed in council chambers across the galaxy. Some species began questioning long-standing policies that had accepted territorial disputes, resource conflicts, and social injustices as inevitable aspects of interstellar civilization. Others doubled down on plans for human containment, arguing that human moral frameworks were a form of cultural weapon that would destroy the stability that existing power structures provided. The breaking point came when the Viridian Republic, a mid-tier civilization struggling with internal separatist movements, formally requested human assistance with conflict mediation. The request bypassed established galactic institutions and diplomatic protocols, directly challenging the authority of species that had maintained order through military and economic dominance. The Council's response was swift and unambiguous. They issued formal warnings against unauthorized contact with Earth, imposed economic sanctions against the Viridian Republic, and began mobilizing military forces to enforce quarantine around the Sol system. But they had underestimated both human capabilities and the depth of dissatisfaction with existing galactic institutions. Within hours of the Council's announcement, 17 different species formally requested human protection from what they characterized as authoritarian overreach by galactic leadership. The requests came from diverse sources: oppressed minorities seeking liberation, exploited colonies demanding independence, and subordinate species challenging hierarchical power structures. Humans found themselves facing a choice that would define the future of galactic civilization. They could accept quarantine and abandon the species that had asked for their help, maintaining peace through moral compromise. Or they could honor their protective instincts and risk interstellar war by challenging the fundamental assumptions of galactic society. Secretary General Santos's response, delivered during an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly and broadcast throughout human space, demonstrated exactly why galactic leadership feared human moral frameworks. The United Nations was founded on the principle that all intelligent beings possess inherent dignity and the right to determine their own destiny. We cannot abandon those principles simply because extending them beyond Earth proves inconvenient for existing power structures. If other species choose isolation over justice, that is their decision. But humanity will stand with any being who seeks freedom, protection, or the right to live according to their own values. The declaration was simultaneously transmitted to every species that had requested human assistance, along with detailed offers of protection, support, and alliance. Within 24 hours, human naval forces had deployed throughout disputed regions of galactic space, establishing defensive positions around threatened worlds and opening humanitarian corridors for refugees seeking sanctuary. The response from galactic leadership was immediate and overwhelming. Military forces from 12 different species began converging on human positions, demanding withdrawal and threatening to enforce quarantine through whatever means proved necessary. The most powerful naval coalition in galactic history was assembling to contain a single species that had been in space for less than a century. But as Zektar monitored the military buildup, he detected something that made his worst fears seem inadequate. Human defensive preparations weren't focused on military victory. They were designed around protecting the species that had requested sanctuary. Every human strategic position was calculated to maximize defensive coverage for allied worlds. Every human fleet movement prioritized evacuation routes for civilian populations. Every human diplomatic communication emphasized their willingness to accept peace terms that guaranteed protection for their new allies. Humans were preparing to fight the entire galaxy to protect species they had met weeks earlier. The mathematical implications were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that human forces would be outnumbered by approximately 50-1 when the Galactic Coalition completed its mobilization. Human technology was impressive, but not superior to the combined capabilities of 12 mature interstellar civilizations. By every rational calculation, human resistance would be crushed within months, possibly weeks. But Zektar had spent enough time observing humans to understand that rational calculations didn't apply to species that had weaponized compassion. Humans didn't fight according to mathematical probabilities. They fought according to moral imperatives. They would find ways to win because the alternative was abandoning beings they had committed to protect. As the largest military confrontation in galactic history approached, Zektar found himself facing a choice that would define his own future. He could maintain his role as neutral observer, documenting the conflict for scientific analysis while remaining safely distant from its outcome. Or he could acknowledge what his months of observation had taught him. The humans represented the best hope for creating a galactic civilization worthy of the beings who inhabited it. The decision came when he received an encrypted message from Colonel Sarah Martinez, transmitted on frequencies that bypassed galactic monitoring systems. The message was brief and direct. Dr. Zektar, we know you've been observing us. We could use an ally who understands both human capabilities and galactic politics. If you're interested in helping us avoid a war that will cost millions of lives, please respond. Zektar stared at the message for several minutes, understanding that his response would irreversibly change his relationship with both human and galactic societies. He thought about the rescue operations he had observed, the protective instincts he had documented, and the moral frameworks that had consistently chosen service over domination. Then, he composed his reply. Colonel Martinez, I have spent my career studying dangerous species throughout the galaxy. You're the most dangerous species I have ever encountered. Dangerous to injustice, oppression, and the assumption that civilized beings must choose between power and principle. I will be honored to help you prove that civilization can do better. As he transmitted the message, Zektar realized that he was no longer documenting the emergence of humanity in galactic space. He was participating in the transformation of galactic civilization itself. The fear he had discovered while standing among humans wasn't fear of their violence or their power. It was fear of their example. They had shown him what civilized beings could become when they refused to accept the moral compromises that made oppression possible. Now it remained to be seen whether the galaxy was ready to follow their lead, or whether it would choose destruction over transformation. Either way, Zektar knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The war that was supposed to last weeks stretched into months, and the galaxy discovered that every assumption about human limitations had been catastrophically wrong. Zektar, now serving as an unofficial liaison between human command and defecting galactic forces, found himself documenting the systematic dismantling of military doctrines that had dominated interstellar warfare for millennia. The first shock came during the Battle of Kepler Station, where a combined fleet of 4 galactic powers attempted to overwhelm human defenses through sheer numerical superiority. Standard military doctrine suggested that human forces, outnumbered 12-1, would either retreat to more defensible positions or accept destruction while inflicting maximum casualties on the attacking fleet. Instead, humans did something unprecedented. They prioritized the protection of enemy non-combatants over their own tactical advantages. Admiral Chun, commanding the Human Defense Fleet, had identified civilian evacuation ships among the attacking forces. Rather than targeting those vessels to reduce enemy capabilities, human forces established protective corridors that allowed non-combatant ships to withdraw from the battle zone safely. They then transmitted detailed medical assistance offers to enemy vessels that had taken damage during the engagement. The psychological effect on attacking forces was devastating. Fleet commanders found themselves ordering attacks against beings who were simultaneously trying to save their civilian populations. The cognitive dissonance broke military discipline across multiple species, leading to the first large-scale defections from the Galactic Coalition. But it was the aftermath of the battle that revealed the true scope of human strategic thinking. Instead of pursuing fleeing enemy forces or consolidating territorial gains, human fleets immediately began search and rescue operations for survivors from destroyed vessels, including enemy survivors. Medical ships from Earth treated wounded Coalition personnel alongside human casualties, applying the same standards of care regardless of species or allegiance. More disturbing for galactic leadership, humans began psychological rehabilitation programs for captured enemy personnel. Rather than standard prisoner detention, they implemented counseling services, educational opportunities, and cultural exchange programs designed to help Coalition soldiers understand the moral frameworks that motivated human behavior. Zektar observed the first session between human counselor Dr. Angela Rodriguez and a captured Altarian naval officer designated as Commander Thekvar. The conversation, which Zektar monitored through translator systems, revealed the depth of human commitment to transforming their enemies into allies. "Commander," Dr. Rodriguez began, "can you help me understand why your fleet targeted the civilian transports in the Deneb sector? Our tactical analysis suggests those ships posed no military threat." Thekvar's response reflected standard galactic military thinking. Civilian infrastructure supports enemy war capabilities. Destroying it reduces their ability to sustain prolonged conflict. "I understand the tactical logic," Rodriguez continued, "but how do you reconcile that approach with your species' philosophical traditions? Our xenoanthropologists have studied Altarian culture, and your historical texts emphasize the protection of non-combatants as a fundamental principle of honorable warfare." The question forced Thekvar to confront contradictions that galactic military culture had trained him to ignore. Over subsequent sessions, Rodriguez helped him explore the psychological mechanisms that had allowed his civilization to abandon moral principles they had once considered central to their identity. Within 3 weeks, Thekvar had not only provided detailed intelligence about Coalition military capabilities, but had also requested asylum in human space. More importantly, he had begun developing proposals for reforming Altarian military doctrine according to principles that combine tactical effectiveness with ethical warfare. The rehabilitation programs produced similar results across dozens of different species. Coalition personnel who entered human custody as dedicated enemies emerged as advocates for human moral frameworks. They returned to their home civilizations carrying messages about societies that had solved conflicts their own species considered impossible to resolve. The defection rates became so severe that Coalition leadership was forced to classify contact with human personnel as a form of psychological warfare and implement extreme measures to prevent cultural contamination among their forces. But the real transformation was occurring among the species that had requested human protection. Zektar documented the remarkable changes taking place on worlds that had become human protectorates, observing social and technological developments that exceeded the most optimistic predictions of human strategic planners. The most dramatic example was the Viridian Republic, where human intervention had prevented a civil war between the central government and separatist colonies. Instead of imposing a military solution, human advisors had implemented what they called collaborative governance, a system that addressed the legitimate grievances of all parties while maintaining territorial integrity and social stability. The process began with comprehensive analysis of the underlying causes of Viridian social conflict. Human social scientists, working with local experts, identified economic inequality, cultural suppression, and political disenfranchisement as the primary drivers of separatist movements. Rather than treating these issues as security threats to be contained, humans approached them as social problems to be solved. The solutions they developed defied every principle of galactic political science. Economic inequality was addressed through resource redistribution programs that enhanced prosperity for all Viridian populations rather than simply maintaining stability through managed scarcity. Cultural suppression was eliminated through educational reforms that celebrated diversity rather than enforcing conformity. Political disenfranchisement was resolved through governmental restructuring that expanded representation while maintaining administrative efficiency. Most remarkably, the entire transformation was accomplished without external control or imposed authority. Human advisors provided expertise and resources, but all decisions remained under Viridian control. The result was a social system that was simultaneously more stable, more prosperous, and more free than anything the Republic had achieved through centuries of traditional governance. The success of human intervention programs created a cascade effect throughout galactic space. Species that had struggled with internal conflicts for generations began requesting human assistance. Civilizations that had accepted systemic injustices as inevitable started exploring alternatives based on human moral frameworks. Entire sectors of galactic space began experimenting with governmental and economic systems that prioritized individual dignity over institutional control. The transformation terrified established galactic powers, but it was unstoppable. Every human success created demand for more human involvement. Every species that experienced human protection became an advocate for human principles. Every conflict that humans resolved through moral innovation became a model that other civilizations wanted to replicate. Coalition leadership found themselves fighting a war they could not win through military means. They could destroy human fleets, devastate human worlds, and eliminate human personnel, but they could not eliminate human ideas. The moral frameworks that humans had introduced into galactic civilization had taken on a life of their own, spreading through communication networks, cultural exchanges, and simple observation of human behavior. The end came not through military defeat, but through moral exhaustion. Coalition forces found themselves fighting to preserve systems that increasing numbers of their own populations had begun to question. They were defending hierarchical power structures against beings who demonstrated that those hierarchies were unnecessary. They were protecting institutional privileges that seemed increasingly indefensible when compared to human alternatives. The final break occurred during the siege of New Geneva, a human colony world that had become a symbol of resistance to coalition authority. Coalition forces had surrounded the planet, demanding unconditional surrender and threatening orbital bombardment if their terms were rejected. Military analysts predicted that human defenders would either accept defeat or fight to the last civilian to prevent coalition occupation. Instead, humans opened communication channels with every ship in the coalition fleet and broadcast a message that changed the course of galactic history. The message was delivered by Dr. James Park, the same scientist who had participated in first contact negotiations months earlier. Standing in the command center of a colony, facing imminent destruction, he spoke directly to the Coalition personnel who had been ordered to destroy his world. To the crews of the Coalition fleet, we know that many of you joined this conflict because you believed we represented a threat to galactic stability. We understand your concerns, and we want to address them directly. We are not trying to conquer your civilizations or impose our values through force. We are trying to demonstrate that there are alternatives to the systems that have made conflict inevitable throughout galactic history. You have been told that our moral frameworks are naive idealism that cannot survive contact with galactic realities. We ask you to consider the evidence of your own experience. Has treating beings with dignity made us weaker or stronger? Has protecting our enemies made them more dangerous or more willing to seek peaceful solutions? Has prioritizing justice over power made galactic civilization less stable or more hopeful? We know that many of you have begun questioning the orders you have received, the systems you have been asked to defend, and the future you're fighting to preserve. Those questions are not treason. They are wisdom. You have seen alternatives to the way things have always been, and you are asking whether those alternatives might be better. We cannot force you to change your minds, but we can offer you choices. Any personnel who wish to defect to human protection will be welcomed without conditions. Any ships that wish to withdraw from this conflict will be allowed to leave safely. Any species that wish to explore alternatives to hierarchical power structures will receive our full support and assistance. But for those who choose to continue this conflict, understand what you are really fighting for. You're not fighting to protect your civilizations from human aggression. You're fighting to prevent your own people from experiencing the freedoms that we have offered to every species we have encountered. You are not defending galactic stability. You are defending systems that have created the conflicts, injustices, and oppressions that have plagued interstellar civilization for centuries. Choose carefully. The galaxy is watching. The message was transmitted simultaneously to every ship in the Coalition fleet, every homeworld represented in the conflict, and every species that had remained neutral in the war. Within hours, defections began on a scale that made continued military action impossible. Entire fleets switched sides, bringing their crews, equipment, and detailed intelligence about Coalition capabilities. More importantly, the message triggered popular movements throughout galactic space as civilian populations began demanding explanations for why their governments were fighting to prevent them from experiencing the benefits of human moral frameworks. Protests erupted on dozens of worlds. Governmental coalitions collapsed under popular pressure, and species after species withdrew from the military coalition to begin independent negotiations with Earth. The Galactic Council's final session was a formality. Representatives of the remaining coalition powers gathered to negotiate terms of surrender, but the negotiations revealed that there was nothing left to surrender. The war had not been won through military conquest, but through moral transformation. The galaxy had chosen human values over galactic institutions. Zektar, attending the negotiations as part of the human diplomatic team, watched as the galaxy's most powerful leaders struggled to understand how their superior forces, advanced technology, and centuries of experience had been defeated by a species that had been in space for less than a century. The answer was simpler than they could accept. Humans had not defeated the Galactic Coalition. They had offered something better than what the Coalition was defending. They had proven that strength could coexist with compassion, that stability could coexist with justice, and that civilization could advance without sacrificing the beings it claimed to serve. In the years that followed, Zektar documented the remarkable transformation of galactic civilization under human influence. The hierarchical power structures that had dominated interstellar relations were replaced by collaborative networks that prioritized mutual benefit over competitive advantage. Economic systems based on scarcity and exploitation evolved into abundance frameworks that enhance prosperity for all participants. Military doctrines focused on conquest and domination gave way to defensive strategies designed to protect rather than destroy. Most importantly, the moral compromises that have been accepted as inevitable aspects of galactic civilization became unthinkable. Species that had spent centuries oppressing their neighbors began exploring partnership opportunities. Civilizations that had maintained order through fear started building societies based on hope. Conflicts that had persisted for generations found resolution through innovative approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than merely managing symptoms. The transformation was not without challenges. Some species struggled to adapt to systems that required personal responsibility rather than institutional control. Others found it difficult to abandon cultural traditions that had been based on dominance hierarchies. A few civilizations chose isolation rather than participate in a galaxy that no longer tolerated systematic injustice. But for the vast majority of galactic civilization, the human influence created opportunities that had been unimaginable under the old systems. Art, science, philosophy, and technology flourished as beings who had been suppressed by hierarchical structures found themselves free to pursue their potential. Trade and cultural exchange expanded as species discovered that cooperation produced better outcomes than competition. Exploration and development accelerated as resources were redirected from military spending to productive purposes. Zektar's final report to the newly reformed Galactic Federation summarized his conclusions about the human impact on interstellar civilization. Humanity represents the most significant evolutionary advancement in galactic history, not because of their technology, military capabilities, or scientific achievements, but because they have demonstrated that intelligent beings can transcend the limitations that have constrained civilizational development for millions of years. They have proven that consciousness, properly applied, can overcome the fundamental problems that have made conflict, injustice, and oppression seem inevitable. The fear I discovered while standing among humans was not fear of their power, but fear of their example. They have shown us what we could become if we chose to prioritize principle over pragmatism, service over self-interest, and hope over resignation. They have revealed that the problems we accepted as unsolvable were actually choices we had made about what kind of beings we wanted to be. Galactic civilization will never be the same, and that is exactly what it needed to become. As Zektar completed his final observations, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from fearful observer to willing participant in humanity's transformation of the galaxy. He had begun his research believing that humans were simply another species to be cataloged and understood. He had discovered instead that they represented something unprecedented in cosmic history. Beings who had learned to weaponize love, militarize compassion, and turn protective instincts into the foundation for a civilization that could serve all its members rather than exploit them. The true fear he had experienced while standing among humans had not been fear of what they might do to the galaxy, but fear of what the galaxy might do to them. He had been afraid that contact with galactic civilization would corrupt human moral frameworks, force them to accept the compromises that had made systematic injustice seem inevitable, and transform them into just another species competing for dominance in a fundamentally unjust system. Instead, humans had transformed galactic civilization according to their own principles. They had proven that moral frameworks were not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be developed. They had demonstrated that consciousness could evolve beyond the limitations that had constrained intelligent life throughout the known universe. As Zektar prepared to begin his new assignment, documenting the continued evolution of human-influenced galactic civilization, he realized that his greatest discovery had not been about humanity at all. It had been about the potential that existed within every sentient being to transcend their circumstances and create something better than what had existed before. Humans had simply been the first species to fully realize that potential. Now it remained to be seen how far consciousness could evolve when freed from the assumption that progress required the exploitation of others. The future, for the first time in galactic history, was genuinely unknown, and that Zektar reflected as he began his new research, was the most hopeful discovery of all.